But instead, this had to do with petty grudges between him and other commanding generals. So anyway, that's just another factor too, that sort of the history that's written immediately afterwards paints him as a scapegoat. But
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, all people sometimes have a tendency to scapegoat. I mean, oftentimes we want to blame others for our own failings, but it just seemed like the Southerners, some of them who were actual generals in the Civil War and then others later, they, especially Southern historians, military leaders, scholars, and whatnot, they had a tendency to really scapegoat. They just could not accept the possibility that they were just beaten fair and square, and they were beaten enough times to where they lost the war. It just seemed to them like there had to be some other reason. You had to have traitorous commanders or incompetent people like Pemberton, for example. They blamed Longstreet. It was another one that got blamed a lot because he wasn't aggressive enough. He was actually a more defensive-minded general, really more forward-looking, as we'll see when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. But it's just very interesting that you had this idea of the lost cause and the idea that, yeah, we would have won if we had equal resources, but we had too many fatal things happen to us. It wasn't really our fault that we lost. It was just we were dealing with too many disadvantages that we couldn't help.
Right. That, well, we had a severe manpower shortage, but then they would say, well, despite that, we did well. And the Northerners were these effete city boys who couldn't handle the hot climate. So they were being taken out by disease and fatigue from the weather, where our, Southern boys could keep going. But yeah, anyway, we'll get more into that. I think, especially when we match up Grant versus Lee, because I think a lot of this mythologizing can come down to them, and they instill a lot of these stereotypes and cliches that have to do with the Civil War. But let's look at what happens after this with a few other fortified positions. So can you talk about Port Hudson?
Sure. One of the misconceptions people have is that after Vicksburg, now the Union has complete control of the Mississippi and the Confederacy is cut in two. Technically, that's not correct because, as I mentioned before, the Confederates controlled a 200-mile river stretch. I don't mean it's not like land miles or by the way the crow flies, but it's the river bends a lot. 200 miles of river mileage was controlled between Vicksburg and Port Hudson. Port Hudson was the southern anchor of that. That's got to be taken too. You can't just take Vicksburg. You've got to take the other bookend of the Confederate controlled portion of the Mississippi. So that's exactly what happens. In late May, General Nathaniel Banks marches an army to the Confederate garrison at Port Hudson. And Port Hudson, like Vicksburg, was a major fortified position. It wasn't quite as powerful as Vicksburg, but it was still quite powerful. Banks, like Grant, twice tried frontal assaults in late May and early June. And he also was using African-American soldiers. I might mention in passing, the Confederates obviously were not very happy about that. Both of these assaults fail. And then, also like Grant, Banks decides to lay siege to the town. The city surrenders on July 9th. And this is 5 days after Vicksburg falls. So on the 9th of July, now the Union controls the entire Mississippi. Nathaniel Banks is an interesting general. He was a political general. He had no military experience, at least nothing significant. Not a West Pointer. He had served in Congress. He'd even been Speaker of the House for a while. He'd been governor of his state. Pretty sure it was Massachusetts, but I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. So don't sue me if it's the wrong state. But I do remember he was briefly Speaker of the House, but now he's a general. And here he has a significant victory. We're going to see later he's not going to have such a great career, but this gets him some notice. And he's basically just copying Grant. He's doing the same. He's using the Grant formula, which works. And once Port Hudson was captured, that was another huge obstacle that was overthrown by the Union. Lincoln said famously, "The father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea." I love that quote. Lincoln had a way.
Yeah.
Lincoln was pretty decent with words, wasn't he?
He was
pretty decent, pretty good. One other victory that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it was very important at the time that I want to mention is Tullahoma. This is in Tennessee. We talked about at the beginning of last episode, we talked about the Battle of Murfreesboro or Stones River, which was in Tennessee. After that battle, that was the one that we've talked about several battles, and hopefully our listeners aren't going crazy like trying to remember all these different things. But suffice it to say that was the one where Bragg, who at the time was in command of the Western Confederate armies, he marched north into Tennessee, and the Union commander Rosecrans marched down to meet him. They fought a battle there that lasted a few days and resulted in 30% casualties, which was the highest percentage that we've seen in the entire war, and we'll see. And since then, they'd just been pretty much sitting there. Lincoln had been begging Rosecrans to get going. And Rosecrans finally does in June. This is several months later because the Battle of Stones River was in December, January. So in June, Rosecrans marches his army of 63,000 southward, and he does a masterful thing here. Instead of hitting Bragg head on, he does the old flanking trick. Not that it's a trick, but he will move around to one side of Bragg's army. He threatens to get behind, and he forces Bragg to retreat. And this just keeps going. It's almost like a dance. The Union starts to get around the Confederate lines. The Confederates back up. They go further south, further south, further south. And they finally end up at Chattanooga, which is where he had started from long ago. So again, it's a different kind of Union victory. It's actually not a bloody battle this time. It's actually a strategic, it's a strategic victory, but he's using tactical maneuvers just to push. It's almost like a sumo wrestling match. But if you can imagine where they're just moving, they're not even really pushing, trying to just get around. And so he basically pushes the Confederate army almost completely out of Tennessee. He's at Chattanooga, but of course that's in the extreme southeast corner of Tennessee. Any further, he'll be back into Georgia. So we had three major Union triumphs in this episode and in the year of 1863 within just not even 1 month of each other. In a less than 30-day period, we see Vicksburg falls, Port Hudson falls, the Mississippi is now completely under Union control, and then at Tullahoma, where Rosecrans is able to push the Confederates back almost out of Tennessee. These three victories provide a great boost to Northern morale, plus the other victory, which shall go unnamed for the time being, but we'll do it next time. I don't want to spoil the surprise. And they cause Southern morale to plunge. The Southerners previously had thought themselves on the verge of victory. They saw themselves as unbeatable, and now they realize we may be about to lose this thing, but they're obviously not going to give up yet.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. We've really gotten into the weeds in this episode, but just to take a step back, consider where we were 2 episodes ago, where the Union was suffering defeat after humiliation, despite having overwhelming numbers and manpower, and the Confederacy really thinking themselves the spiritual heirs of the American Revolution, fighting the British with their gumption and plucky courage against a superior and better armed foe who thought themselves invincible. But now the tides are turning. Now it seems like the right capable generals are in place. They're deploying tactics that actually work. They're taking action and moving faster than their opponent for once. So a shocking reversal of fortunes of the Confederacy, who thought themselves that they were on this noble mission. So there must be some doubt and soul searching that's taking place here. But we got to mention we cannot forget, we got to remind ourselves that all of these great things you mentioned, at least the ones we've talked about, they're happening in the West. We've got to see what can happen in the East. Can we have a victory, a real victory in the East? That's, everybody, and this drove Lincoln crazy, but a lot of the country, and especially people overseas, the British, the French, were completely fixated on the East. They didn't,
Lincoln would say, well, we've won all these victories in the West, and yet Britain and France and a lot of the Northern public, they just don't seem to care. They just want to, they're not happy until we get a victory in the East. So that's what we're looking for.
And Lincoln, the statesman, but also the politician, knows that he needs a solid victory showing that the war is definitely coming to a close, or re-election might not be so easy.
Yep, yeah.
And European powers who are sitting on the sidelines, they're not supporting the Confederacy, but the Union really wants to give them a sign not to throw their hat in or even think about it. So like you said, yeah, we need some closure happening out in the East. So as you alluded to, there are important things happening in the East at this exact same time. We won't spoil that. So we'll show you what's happening out East in the next episode. All right, well, that was the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Freza, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, and Melissa Sarnowski, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you want to support the show and help me keep producing this content, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, subscribe to the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com, and there you'll find instructions. 2, join our Facebook group, which you can find if you just search for History Unplugged. And please like and share posts that I put up about new episodes. 3, submit a question to me so that I can answer it on air. You can email me at info@historyonthenet.com or leave a voicemail. And again, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com and you'll find instructions. Lastly, and I think this one is the best, is to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the Eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the Scouts and Intelligence Officers, but you also get a shout-out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you will be put at the very front of the line for me to answer your question about history, and I can guarantee I will dedicate an episode that's about an hour long or so to your question. Sign up at patreon.com/unplugged. Again, that's patreon.com/unplugged. Anyway, those are the ways you can help out the show. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.